So, the first of the demos we're going to look at here for this chapter, chapter 5, with looping, is the pre versus post increment evaluation. It's the very first one here inside of the chapter 5 module. Some things to note as we go ahead and open this in the background and navigate over here. Now, the first portion here, so it's really essentially lines 28 and above. You are not necessarily going to see any difference with a pre versus a post increment, and we're going to get into that. But when we're actually doing the looping structures, you will notice that there's a difference between how the behavior of the pre-increment and how the behavior of the post-increment will impact your loops. So remember here with looping that one of the things we want to avoid is the off by one error. We do not want either one too few or one too many loop iterations, and the pre and post increment kind of leads a lot of students into the off by one issue. So just as a little bit of a setup, I have a number that starts at 4 and that literally means nothing. I just wanted to show you something that doesn't start with 0 or 1 for kicks and giggles. And essentially I'm just going to go ahead and run this so we can highlight the text and just kind of talk about what's happening here as we go through. So here in line number 8, the variable num is, and here we can see because I have not incremented that number any, it's still set to 4. Here on line number 12, we have a postfix increment to num. So the way that looks is num plus plus. Now, postfix again is after, right? So if you think about things like C++, what essentially we're saying is we're taking C and then we are incrementing it, right? So if you kind of think of it that way, it's we already have the balance of what's going on with the language C and we're adding to it. So here with the postfix increment, we've already got what's happening with num and then we are adding to it. So now on line 13, that is this block of display right here. Now because I've done that increment, the value of num is 5. Here I'm going to use a prefix increment, so this is plus plus num. So what that means is before number is, or num rather, the variable num is being used, we are actually doing the increment on it. Here in line 12, what we're doing is we're using the value of num and then we're incrementing it. So that's what the big difference here is. This time we're incrementing num and then using it. Here on line 12, we're using num and then incrementing it. But you'll notice with my increments and my decrements here through the rest of the balance of the first 28 lines here, 24 lines here of our program, that nothing really looks like it's happening in any different a way than, you know, if I just took num plus equals 1, right? Because then I'm taking the value stored in num, I am adding to it 1, and then I'm saving it back in the variable called num. Now here's where the pre versus the postfix increment makes a difference. And remember, postfix is like we see here on num plus plus. So this is the one I think most, actually it has been my experience that most students will use the postfix increment by preference rather than the prefix increment. And that is right down here inside of our first block here. So that is what we actually see here in the output window. Here again I have declared an integer variable. I've called it numTest and I have set it to 1 so that I can start someplace, right? The other place to start this would be at 0, but then if I only run this for 10 loops, it's going to stop at 9, and most end users would have, remember, they would have an issue with 10 loops starting at 0 and working through 9. So that's what this reflects here as well. So you'll notice I have on line 33 that my num test is set to 1. And here inside of my for loop, I am on line 37, C out, num test plus plus, and then end line. So the post increment works as follows. What we're essentially doing, that's right here, the number 1 after this kind of breach here in content, is first thing that happens is C out. So what happens here is the terminal is open for output from inside. Next, we display num test. This is where the difference is going to be, right? So because this is a postfix operator, num test is going to be displayed first. The value of num test is 1, and then we're going to end that line. After this, that plus plus is going to take effect. Num test now will have a value of 2, and we're going to come back up through our for loop. So what happens next? We're going to evaluate this statement for truth. Is I less than 10? No, I in this case equals to 1, and away we go. So around and around and through this particular for loop will go, and you'll notice that essentially each time we come through here, num test, which to begin with was equal to 1, is going to be incremented after the display. In juxtaposition to that, down here, the second breach of text is the prefix operator, plus plus, and then num test. Essentially what happens here is there's only one small alteration between these two pieces of code. So I have reset num test back to 1. I have just given us the same little spacing of 3 new line characters. And here inside of my for loop, the for loop is exactly the same. So you'll notice that when I highlighted line 43 here, line 35 was highlighted in its entirety. That means they're identical. So the only thing different between lines 35 and that code block thereafter and line 43 and this code block hereafter is the pre versus the post increment. So this time around on lines 43 through 46, I have the pre-incrementation happening here. So essentially what's happening is I have set, for the first loop through, I have set num test equal to 1. I have opened up my my output stream here for a cout statement. I am going to first increment num test and then display num test, and after that end that line. So you'll notice the difference here is because we've incremented num test before we've displayed it, we get a 2 here instead of a 1. And instead of ending at 10 like our first for loop did, the second for loop ends at 11. And the whole reason for this is because we are using a pre-increment as opposed to a post-increment. So there might not feel like a tremendous amount of difference between the two of these, especially now in the beginning as you're kind of getting your feet wet with everything. But what I will tell you is that can have a fairly substantive impact on how it is that your for loops work. So be aware. And actually, I will tell you that having graded, assignments like this and similar and worked with by now dozens of classes on this material, what I can tell you is I see far and away more of the post increment like we do here on line 37, num test plus plus. And probably reflexively, that's the one that you are going to go to as well. But know that there is a difference here with the pre-increment as opposed to the post-increment for an iteration.